Okay, so this is the notes for 04. So we're looking at shifts. So I've put down some steps that we can kind of think about when we're graphing. We want to be able to understand where the vertical shift is, or the center line. We want to know the phase shift. Okay, so we want to know where the starting point of our graph is going to be. We want to have a period so we can figure out the end point. We want to be able to divide it into the 4 quadrants to be able to find the min, max, and middle points, and also use the symmetry to be able to draw the graph. And we want to know the amplitude to know how high up and down we need to draw this graph. Okay, so here we're combining the variations. Now what's important to recognize is if I want to know the horizontal shift, now this is very important for horizontal shift. When it's in factored form, it's going to be compress, expand first, shift last. And that's really what we want, because the shift last allows us to compress and expand. Our reference point is 0, so it doesn't move. And then we're going to shift last to make this the starting position of the graph. So this is where our graph is going to start from. That last shift then indicates our horizontal shift of the starting position. So when we're graphing this, then we want to know amplitude. Amplitude is 1. We want to know the vertical shift. Okay, that's going to be equal to +1. We want to know the horizontal shift. Since it's in factored form, we're going to use this factored form. And we end up with a shift of plus pi/2. So the last part, the period, well, notice that there is a horizontal compression factor going on here. Okay, this is a horizontal compression. That's going to affect the period. The period of the sine graph is normally 2 pi, but it's now going to be compressed by 2. So the period is going to be pi. So we end up doing this, 2 pi divided by the compression factor b, and our new period is pi. Okay, so those are the 4 main parts that we need to have when we graph this. So sketching this graph then, I'm going to do my horizontal shift first. So I'm going to put my x-axis, or my y-axis right about here. I know that I'm going to shift to the right, and I'm going to draw it to the right. So I'm going to do my horizontal shift. I'm going to use that point there as my horizontal shift to the right. That's my starting position. I'm going to use my period to get my end position. Actually, I'm going to shift that so I can get a little bit more scale. So my shift and my period should be relative to each other. So I'm going to make my pi/2 here. This is going to represent my shift to pi/2. That means that this represents pi/4, pi/2. So that end position should be at 3 pi/2. So this means that there's pi, here's 3 pi/2. Okay, so recognize the scaling that I'm using here. There's my end position. So I'm going to draw my quadrants. Really, I can just draw my quadrants by eye because I know that it's symmetrical. We're just going to split into half and half. So those are my quadrants. But what's important is I need to get those coordinates of those quadrants. And again, I'm going to do that by using the middle. So halfway between 1/2 and 1.5 is 1 pi. Okay, so it's going to be pi. Halfway between half a pi and a whole pi is 3/4 pi. Okay, or I can add and divide. So 1/2 plus 1 divided by 2 is 3/4. And then between 1 and 1.5 is 1.25, or 5 pi/4. Okay, so those are my quadrant boundaries. I'm going to now use my vertical shift. I'm going to shift it up 1. Okay, there's my middle line. It's a sine graph. It starts in the bottom. It's going to go up to 2, back down to the middle, down to 0, and back up to the middle. And I can sketch in my 4 quadrants symmetrically in this way. So there it is. There's my sine graph. Now I have all the variations involved. My expansion flips, my horizontal expansion flips in here, my horizontal shift, my vertical shift, and I've related it to my amplitude, my middle, my period, okay, my vertical shift, my horizontal shift. Okay, so there it is. So the key then is we always want to factor out the b term so that allows us, that B here, right here, the 2, that allows us to calculate the period, and that's going to help us draw the graph.